So thanks for coming, and let's see.
Yes,
The
thank you
floor
very much.
is yours.
So, yeah, this is what I'm presenting today is a part of a research project that is in its second of 3 years, and it's called. The project is a provincially funded project called Masks of the Genius Loci, or Genius Loci, as we sometimes say in English. And it's a project about streets and about a lot of streets. So trying to figure out how can we, because sometimes in architecture, you know, it's like we want to know more about a street and we start taking all these kind of analytical methods and we go into depth on that particular street in time and space, etc. But my interest was to say, okay, what can we do today with machine learning and with the ability to curate large amounts and collect large amounts of data? How can we start to look at streets, look at single streets, but by looking at them through the lens of all the streets at once. So it's about getting to know these streets and kind of getting to know their characters and their personalities. So this is part of the project that is there's an aspect of it that's very very playful in a way, because if you've ever worked with machine learning and big data yourselves, you would know, or even with just coding and scripting, it's very crafty, it's very iterative. And you can get kind of lost in the crafting of it, even though you get kind of good things eventually come out of it. So this is Quebec. Maybe you don't know where it's located. You can sort of see, so there's a little bit of an aspect of geography here. So this is the province, I think my mouse, yeah. So this is the province takes up all of this space, about like down to here and down to here. You can see that most of the streets, there are about 200,000 streets documented as objects in OpenStreetMap that can be downloaded via an API. It also contains little villages that are also in the north, which are part of the Inuit controlled territory or administered territory, called Nunavik. It's still part of the province, and so it's not just about the city streets, I would say, but about streets that are found also in rural areas and in small villages. So trying to get them all kind of to be articulated together and to learn about each of them. So just a little bit more geography. So this is, if you look at southern Quebec, then you have Quebec City, you have Montreal. You've probably heard of Montreal. Quebec City is the capital city of the province. This is the St. Lawrence Seaway coming through here. Gatineau is the town that's right across from Ottawa, which is the capital city in the province of Ontario. Here you have a little bit of the US there, and then New Brunswick, which is the neighboring province. So the fact that this was a provincial funded project meant that I said, okay, let's try it with Quebec, let's just do it in one province, deal with kind of the different data aspects with already quite a bit of data. But of course it'd be fun, I would love to expand it to the whole country or the whole continent or even the whole world. But this is always it's about playing also with different levels of complexity in terms of dealing with lots of data and also acquiring all of that data. So of course we can't visit all of the streets individually. We have the artificial intelligence kind of help us visit certain things and look at them through each other. And the conceptual kind of idea that I have with this is to think of the personalities of the streets as kind of masks. So to think of them as something that one wears when presenting themselves in public. And this is where I really like the etymology of the word person and persona, because it's that through which the something or the self or the personality sounds, this personare. So there's a kind of propagation that happens. So something is articulated through the mask. So we could say maybe that's something like the identity of the street. And then this identity presents itself. The street presents itself to us via a communication channel that we set up. So we kind of decide in a way how to, it's like we're going to meet the street and we don't know really yet how to communicate with the streets. And of course we don't know if they know how to communicate with us, because we know the streets know something, but we would assume the streets don't know that they know something because they're not sentient in the way we are. So there's a kind of communicational bridge we have to set up with them. And so we try to find at the same time the language, but also the sounds of the language that we use to speak with the streets. so we can think of it in terms of sound. So I very much like with sound that you can think, okay, so there's a kind of stream with the data. Things start to get very, very, very noisy. With you have so much data, so many streets, so many different aspects of these streets, depending on how you encode them. And so we learn to kind of modulate them, like with breath, you would modulate them as vowels, and then you break it up, you discretize it as consonants. Through that, a character begins to emerge. That is partially invented and partially discovered, in a way. Because it depends very much on us, of course, because we are figuring out a way to kind of speak to the things that are masked with our own mask, because we personify ourselves relative to a particular context. But of course, if we wanted to take it, we could also take it to the sonic, from the sonic to the luminous, and we could think of it as that through which one's self or one's identity kind of radiates and becomes modulated and discretized, and so how all things kind of shine, which I think is a lovely metaphor for thinking of kind of artificial intelligence as learning how to interact with shining things, learning to communicate with things as they radiate towards us. So this kind of brings us to the idea of the identity of the street, and so I want to pick up maybe another distinction that I like to make, because I know you know maybe and also in architecture that the idea of identity or identity of place, place identity, the spirit of place, so that's where the genius loci comes in, this kind of spirit of place that has been a strong concept in architecture, in architectural theory, and also in urbanism. And I think what's important for me is to, because over time, kind of this identity becomes almost like a form of possession, like, so who does this place belong to, and those people to whom the place belongs are the ones who get to decide what the place's identity is. So I wanted to kind of save it a little bit from that and make a little abstraction by picking up a distinction that Michel Serres, a French philosopher, makes in his book L'Incandescent, the incandescent, where he differentiates identity, which is this tautology of I am me and you are you. And so it's always something that we continue to kind of circulate around, because the identity saying who am I is a question we spend most of our lives asking ourselves. And who are the other people? Who are the people we know and love, etc. And it becomes a kind of infinite. This is for me why it's partially incandescent, so it continues to glow. It never really stops. Whereas belonging is relative to what kinds of sets or classes we belong to. So if we're American or Canadian or Austrian or these kind of things, or if we belong to the sets of people who have the name Michael, like my name. So I try to keep that a little bit as a distinction when thinking about how I'm addressing myself in a way towards the streets that I'm trying to engage with through the modeling setup. So what I also like about the idea of identity is it remains, by being tautological, it is also somewhat irrational and gets involved in the infinite, deals with the infinite, because it's something we can continue to kind of pull from or allow to radiate from, and it's infinite, it never really stops. And so in a way, because it can be kind of it can be somewhat mythical. I like the idea of the spirit of place. So to imagine that like each of these streets kind of has their guardian spirit. It's not really to go back to kind of a mythical or romantic way of thinking. It's not really what I'm looking for, but I like it as a kind of cipher to give a term to this kind of mystery of the street, and to keep that mystery kind of alive. So, but my hope is that it can be done in a rigorous fashion. So, and a bit like the question that the caterpillar asks of Alice, who are you? And Alice is not the right answer, really. It's like he keeps asking, yes, but who are you? So we get in this kind of turning around the idea of the identity. So it's not really a problem that can be solved. And with this idea of infinity, I think we have an interesting relationship to, in architecture, and in painting, of course, to perspective drawing, and to how we deal with this infinity, the infinity relative to the figures that make up infinity. So whether it's, in this case of the Annunciation, prior to the Renaissance, this infinity point was often used to symbolize the divine. So the divine would occupy kind of the location of where the the lines would be, of the image would be directing towards, so the figures look towards, or the column almost becomes or is supported by this kind of the divine figure, which is holding the space together around a point around which things are organized. So we can think of this kind of infinity point as something which is a point that organizes the rest of the world or the cosmos around it. And of course, in architecture with perspective drawing, we were able to develop a technique in which the human being is the point around which infinity can become organized. So we have then the figure who actually enters the image. And so there's a kind of, with the question of identity, and this infinity point, if we think of identity as something around which we situate things, or around which things become organized, then the question also becomes about how to find that particular point to organize the world around it, and not to set it fixed forever, but to try to bridge the kind of absolute of alterity or of otherness, so to say, okay, I am not you, and I can't be you, and you can't be me, because it's just logically impossible. But then also of communion, so to bridge this collective, the fact that we can somehow find a way to communicate with each other and be one of us, yeah, one of the kind of, find a communion around it. So the other figure that I pick up with, because I think it's quite useful for us as architects, because we have these terms available to us, is to think about how perspective was theorized relative to the three terms of the architectonic disposition of Vitruvius, which were the iconographia, which was translated in the Renaissance as the plan, the ground plan, then the orthographia, translated by Alberti, I think, as elevation, and the scenographia, which was the perspective. So you have two things which are orthogonally related to each other, therefore they don't correlate, right? And so to try to set them into proportion is what the scenographia and what the perspective does, to try to get the ground and the faces of the buildings to in some kind of proportionality with each other. And in the techniques of perspective, it's to set it also in relationship to the finite and the infinite, with the eye of the person, and the scene which becomes organized, so the cosmos which becomes organized around the point of the human viewer. So and of course then with the scenographia we can also think of it's interesting because it's related also to the idea of theater and to the masks worn by the actors, which is another way that persona is, persona was also a word for the masks worn by the actors in theater. So of course these are kind of pre-modern concepts, and so it's interesting to think with the attempt by the authors of the proposal by the authors of the Atlas of Digital Architecture to try to give a contemporary face to the architectonic disposition. Because if with Vitruvius we were as architects learning to write with words, and then with Alberti learning to write with lines, today our context that we live in is one in which we also learn to write with code. So how to live in a world in which the world is basically written upon code, or things are articulated in our contemporary culture by code, and then how can we become literate in this? So it's like another challenge. In addition to the word, in addition to the lines, we also now have code. So to think of the elevation then as something related to the particle or data, the plan relative to program, iconographia relative to program, scenographia related to information or the quantum or the ratio between the data and the program. So between kind of space, things that are taken out and given a continuity in time, and then things which change over time and are modulated. So this means then, and this is like, so if things are architectonically disposed, then we can think, or at least I propose to think in the context of the project, of this mask of the genius loci, so of the spirit of the street, as something disposed architectonically. So relative to the continuous, the discrete, and the kind of articulation we have with between the two of them. And this means conceptually that we look at identity not as something that we can solve, but more as something which is an obstacle. So to be embraced, because this is like, it's like it's like the question I was asking, the example I was giving earlier with asking, who am I? We spend our lives turning around kind of the question, who am I? And so this is not something we can't really solve ourselves. Maybe if we're solved, then we're dead, or something like that. But we know in architecture the obstacle of gravity. We don't solve gravity. We have to learn to articulate it. We embrace it so that things that we give a stance to don't fail immediately or don't fall immediately. And I think it's almost a useful metaphor, but at the same time, it's not just a metaphor, because of course we know we have to deal with gravity as a physical thing. So in the setup I'm working with here, then the idea is that you have to, by embracing this obstacle, you have to build a bridge to another domain, from the higher to a lower domain. And so from where the obstacle lives to a lower dimensional domain where we can start to articulate or index these, in this case would be the identities of the streets, or dealing with the streets with their various encodings, or the masks that start to be given to and emerging through the data setup. And then decoding back to the higher level, so the one in which we originally started to talk about streets as we know them, in their kind of richness. So, and that sort of fits with it's in a way of thinking about it, but it's also for me a way of working with the data. So it's almost a model by which, instead of maybe previously we might have said, okay, so what is a street? And then we have to say a street's made up of this and it's made up of that. We develop kind of a theoretical model. So what I'm interested with this approach is saying, okay, we suspend the idea that we can know precisely what a street is, and instead we try to theorize more about how do we engage with the street, a street, streets in general, through different algorithmic techniques. So that means that we have in our high-dimensional the high-dimensional level our big data, the large amount of data that we're working with that has something to do with streets. And then we try to bring it to a level in which we can access it, so we will encode it. I'll show some examples in a second. We can encode it, and then we start to look at the similarities that arise between them, patterns that arise, and then we start to talk about it. So if we were to ask the streets, if we were to look at the streets as just, how they kind of stand or situate themselves geometrically amongst their neighboring streets, we could then say, okay, well, this is how I want to get to know you. And we ask our model then to start to find the patterns. So it starts to look for the patterns and find what is it that, so it tries to say, you are a little bit like this one, you're a little bit like that one, and maybe different from this one, and so your friends are kind of over here, or your kin is over here, and it starts to sort of stabilize around a particular sorting. So it gives us sort of a kind of spectrum of what the streets look like to the machine when it looks at them like this. So we can start to say, you could put this back on a map and say, okay, there are certain ways that the streets always tend to be oriented or engaging with other streets around them. But this maybe can be a bit more of I would say, an abstract face. And maybe I would also like to add that when we talk about, if we talk about streets within an encoding such as this one, and this one maybe in some ways is almost more typical in like research in urban morphology and like street forms and street geometry and things like that. It becomes, even though we have a lot, it's a kind of it's kind of a context in which the streets appear to each other and appear to us in this way. So there's a concept that I think works well for this, which Michel Serres calls a kind of relative universality. So there's a kind of getting everything at once, but the universality of what we have in front of us is relative to this context we've set up. So it's for us here, it's relative to all the streets of the province of Quebec. It'd be nice if it could be relative to the entire planet, right? And then you almost think, is this really everything? Do we really have everything? And then you can talk about a relative universality that approximates universality. I haven't really thought about it on that level, and maybe that's too much. But what I like is the fact that by taking so much, each thing becomes kind of a point from which to look at all the other points. But like I said, this is a kind of abstract face to work with, so I think it's better to work with maybe a little something else that gives a different kind of face to the streets. And that is the fact that in Quebec there are about 200,000 geolocated Flickr photos that people have uploaded online publicly since 2014. They've been uploading them since longer than that, and I'm thinking maybe I should take them all now, because it's very interesting to see what it is that, the point is not really to see what is it that people put on Flickr, but to sort of see what are the kinds of things in general, and where do they, and how do the streets take on a different kind of persona when they are characterized through the pictures people have taken nearby. So as we know, with the same model, with a pre-trained model and a neural network, we can organize the photos according to their similarities, and this uses the CLIP model, contrasted language image pre-training, where we try to start to sort out and discover what are the different kinds of things that are being photographed. What are the kind of materials or components that the streets will present themselves to us with if we characterize them according to these photos. And we have things like flowers and markets and soccer games and people running on the streets and street festivals, and people love taking pictures of planes, churches, different historical buildings, street festivals, night skies. There's a pride parade there. The beaches, trains in the winter. I don't know, lots of people like taking pictures of trains in the winter. That's a whole, so this is like as if we're visiting cells of different zones, or you sort of see the plain neighborhood over here. So these become kind of the ingredients through which the streets start to present themselves to us when we encode them in this way. And so we could have just explored that. Yes, please.
Sorry, is this now a representation of all streets, like clustered with all the images, or is this like specifically from one kind of segment?
This is just from all the photos that were in on that map that I showed earlier.
Yeah.
So it was really just first about indexing the photos and kind of starting to get a generalized mood, I would think, of what it is that people who are taking photos of things and putting them online find worthy of being captured and kept. And for some reason, all these different flowers.
But that's whole Quebec.
All of Quebec, yeah, exactly. So things we don't really see in here are also the fact that there's like a ski-doo, there's like a lot of outdoor winter activities. I just didn't pull any of those. I should have, because it seems to be in the imaginary of how we think of Canada, but there's like ice fishing and all these kinds of other activities. Of course, I was collecting the photos from around the streets, so this kind of needs to happen close by a street, because the idea is not that people go to the street and take a picture just of the street, but it's like the street hosts the things that people then take pictures of.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always a little bit indirect. It's not always the street that is the object of the photo. But when we characterize, if we were to associate each street to its group of photos that were taken nearby, then we can go to other corpuses. So let's imagine that we're going to take we're going to go with our streets to the museum. So the Montreal Museum of Art, the Fine Arts Museum in Montreal, Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal, has in its collection about it has about 6,000 photos. So I wanted to show you kind of the types of artwork that's shown at this museum and the collections that we can play with in the digital collections. So Quebec and Canadian art, early to modern international art, arts of one world, decorative arts and design, contemporary art, graphic and photographic arts. And so the scenario that I would pick up is to imagine, well, let's say, first of all, we want to sort of get to know the collection first. So to kind of see what is it in general that, so when the streets go with their faces that are flowers and trains and night scenes and street festivals, like what are the faces they're meeting with when they meet with the art? So we can see photography, sketches, vases, different other types of objects, paintings, portraits, coins, jewels, so things that come from across the collections. So let's imagine that our scenario is the following. So the Grande Allée is a street that wanders the museum. These are the 4 streets. And the Grande Allée is our guide, our first character, which, and so these are the flicker photos, so which is wandering the museum of these 6,000 artworks and notices that other streets are lingering longer at the same artworks. We have Avenue du Mont-Royal, which is an urban street in Montreal. Grande Allée is an important artery in Quebec City. Rue Mercier and Mont-Laurier, which is north of Ottawa. Avenue William David, Montreal, and they kind of have, they have people manifesting in the streets, street art, vegetable, monuments, things like that. And so we almost start to see, okay, there's a kind of already a personality, a sort of similarities in personalities between these different streets. And so they met each other in front of similar artworks. So these 3 artworks were the ones that they kind of stopped and said, oh, I saw you. Here we are at Jean-Paul Riopel's Iboupel, and oh, I saw you at that one, several times. And then they said, oh, but I also saw you. Weren't you also at the Champ de Cour à Epsom? This painting by, the watercolor painting by Raoul Dufy. And of course, so we get a kind of idea of what it is that they're gravitating towards, because of course these are also urban street scenes or street objects, and there's lots of people gathered around. So we can kind of see that there's a sort of convergence, that they start to, not only do they gravitate towards things that are a little bit similar to them, but they also, for us, show us maybe artworks that we otherwise, us personally, wouldn't know. So I've heard of Riopel because he's a famous Quebec artist, but I don't know Dufy, and I didn't know Silashi. So these other artists, I start to learn more about them. We learn, the streets almost introduce us to the process too. So we learn about the streets on the one hand. We meet streets, and we start to say, oh, this street, I didn't know this street before, but it's interesting that these kinds of things happened there and were taken, and had photos taken of them. And then to be able to say, oh, and they've brought us to the museum. And we start to find these paintings and sculptures that we didn't know about before. And then we could also say, well, which one was only picked up by the Grande Allée and not by any of the others? And that's this one, which is called Maison sans vie, or the house without life. But we don't know why. We don't know why. But it's interesting. When we start to look at the painting, we can start to wonder a little bit about it. We can start to imagine that, oh, why is this painting not shared by the others? Do we need to know exactly why? Maybe we should take this photo and say, let's find all the other streets that would actually have stopped in front of this photo, and then try to think about those streets. What is it about them, and what do we like about them? What seems to be the personality that would bring someone to stand in front of these paintings that for some reason the others didn't. So to build a different network or a different gathering around that particular painting. Rosier by Raymond April, a photography, and then another photography by Bertinsky, the copper mine, the open air copper mine in British Columbia, a photo, and then this painting, this watercolor painting by James William Morris from the late 19th century called Ile de Cauchy. And so these paintings also kind of come to the foreground, and we meet them at the same time that we start to meet these streets. So for me, it's also part of kind of in these large collections, to suddenly zoom in on very particular elements and start to get interested in them, and perhaps start to develop, a curiosity, because again, we can say, well, which painting did the chemin, this first street we followed, Chemin du Quai, of this particular group, it was the only one that went to this painting, called Above Lake Superior. Lake Superior is one of the big lakes, the Great Lakes, by Barry Agagas. And so we could take this painting, again a bit like La Maison sans vie, and we could say, well, let's tell a different story where it's this painting that starts to gather the streets. And so we could start to wonder, okay, which streets would come to see this painting, and what would they what would they have to say about it? If you were to say saying something about it is presenting themselves with these photographic personas. So which photographic personas would be brought to to see this painting or be driven towards this painting? And so that's another kind of direction for a narrative that one can develop that I haven't done yet, but will probably do eventually because I'm curious to see where it takes me. But what I wanted to also talk about is that we can, because we have these open clip models that allow us to, or the clip models including open clip, which is what I'm using, which allow us to associate image and text, I said, well, why don't we bring them to songs? Why don't we see which streets with their photographic faces start to gather around particular songs from Quebec artists in French language artists from Quebec. And you have websites like this one. This one is kind of, yeah, it's kind of funky, but it's the only one that really has a lot of Quebec artists. So Cœur de Pirate from Montreal, she has a bunch of songs on here, and so we scrape them and get the lyrics from each of them and clean them of the kind of noise in them, and then we say, well, let's imagine what would the song's faces be if they were to be brought around these songs, and so for instance. Les rues des Pionniers in Tadoussac and Rue Languedoc in the same village, Chemin de la Feuillade, Chemin Head in the Madeleine Islands, and Rue du Landais in Blainville, a suburb of Montreal. They come with these elements of their photographic masks, of their photographic personas. These are the ones you see here, and they gather around a song called, by Pierre Lapointe, called La Forêt des Mal-Aimés, which is, I'll read it first in French and then a translation. So, dans la forêt des mal-aimés, chaque arbre est un membre oublié. Chaque feuille est une âme délaissée. Dans la forêt des mal-aimés, comme il fait bon s'y promener. Which means something like, in the forest of the poorly loved, each tree is a forgotten member, each leaf an abandoned soul. In the forest of the poorly loved, how nice it is to wander. And we could also have the streets gather around another song. So these streets meet up. The streets Rue Saint-Jean, which happens to be the street I live on in Quebec City, Rue Notre-Dame in Lachine, Rue Régina, Rue du Saint-Lallier in Montreal, and Rue Saint-Jean-Baptiste in Baie-Saint-Paul, which is in the Charlevoix region, good for skiing. They came to the song with these kind of autumnal faces, so faces of fall. And the faces of fall brought them around the song October by a group from Quebec called Les Cowboys Fringants, where the lyrics are « Et octobre vient de passer en coup de vent, une autre année où je n'ai pas pris le temps de voir l'automne s'effeuiller tranquillement », which means something like an October passed in a flash of wind, another year where I didn't take the time to see autumn lose its leaves slowly. So yeah, the translation is always a bit weird. But so it's about also discovering, so for me, perhaps because I live in Quebec and I have a fascination also for these artists that I have also heard their music and seen them, in the kind of social, in the media scene of the province. It's a way to also enter differently into these songs, the music, the artists. So we could take artists from any country or from any particular cultural context and bring the streets to see them. And we start to get to know the streets in a way that is different, but also the songs in a way that is different. Because these streets and these songs, why would they ever properly meet? And so we sort of articulate this and we make this possible. So in my project, I am interested in other types of data. So we can say, what makes this more maybe classic with urban analytics, like what streets meet around being close to things, like stores, or houses, or schools, or civic buildings, or something like that. Or what do the streets look like when they look at each other through the eyes of property that's being sold on them? The streets are sometimes portrayed also through when we try to sell property on a street, the street becomes also part of kind of selling the property, so we can also give them a face relative to that. Also, it could be, satellite data allows us to, these are all then tiles of street forms that are like extracts from satellite images that have that are a moisture index. So you could say, what is it like? So these streets meet around being humid or something like that, or being aqueous. So they have a relationship to water, and that relationship to water and humidity brings them together in kind of little communities of humidity, or however you want to call it. So you can combine these different ones together to kind of tell different stories and to enrich kind of the way we spin around this obstacle of the street identity. And then this one is, as it's green, it's vegetation. So like, what is it like, the vegetationness? What is it like being green? Or how green are you, and how green are we as streets together? And the idea then with this, because this is dealing with a lot of data, and when you're kind of working with this, crafting it and trying to deal with so much at once, you kind of try to figure out, how is it that I want to interact with it personally to make it easier, but also how do I want to work with it in a way that others can work with it. So part of the objective with this project is to develop search engines. So a bit like this one, which I had made for just text. So you can go pick the corpus. Here we type in street and city. I just did those two words because they're the topic of a bit of this talk too. And so then you get extracts from different texts. Some of you, I think, in the studio, you've worked with these kinds of search engines with the Xenoteca. So dealing with then finding. So the idea would be that I would develop a series of search engines, or maybe one search engine, depends how much time I have and how much trouble it turns out to be. But it would allow other people to also query the streets and to maybe find streets based on artworks, or find artworks based on streets, or find songs based on streets, or streets based on songs, and kind of start to gather. Because what I think as architects is interesting is that when we come towards, even if we're not doing urban design or something like that, we always kind of come towards a street with a project. And the streets can take on a kind of persona that we engage in some way with, and I think it's more interesting perhaps to say, how do we engage with them also in relationship to other streets at the same time? Because then we learn about the one street as we learn how it's not like all the other streets that are yet somehow very close to being like it. So we develop a kind of familiarity with the street. And just personally working with it, I also then get a kind of an additional curiosity in a way for the streets. And I would bring these into my studio teaching, because where I teach, we tend to deal with a client that's a fictional character. In the past couple of years, I've been bringing fictional characters from the work of Michel Serres, because he's developed a series of figures that represent or index, in a way, certain things having to do with the contemporary human condition, whether it's pollution. Yeah, so you have the malprop there. He's the figure of pollution. About the planet as a victim, how we learn, how we interact and engage with technology. So these kind of figures that represent our times. And then we were also in the most recent studio dealing with a patron. So the patron, we were in we were doing inns, so the clients were our innkeepers, and the patron had invited them. So the neighborhood is called Saint-Roch. So it's named for Saint-Roch de Montpellier, which is a saint. And these are his the different ways he's figured in painting and in sculpture. And so he kind of invited these clients to come and set up inns in his neighborhood, because he had kind of ideas. He wanted ideas for how to live kind of well in his neighborhood, but on the terms of these different hosts, these different clients, these different innkeepers. So to imagine maybe that the street can then also become this kind of patron or client that we engage with as a kind of figure or persona that we work with, who also then hosts all the people who would come to that street. So it's not to take away from the fact that there are real people that are actually on the streets, but to say, how can we become like a host in a particular way for the kinds of things that would happen on this particular street, based on all sorts of things, its persona, and maybe the different things it's connected to. And these in my studios then become very multimedia, and the students pick up. These are two examples these are just extracts from their videos from last semester, where they design the inns for these different innkeepers, and they get kind of moods around the projects via clips from cinema, They pull images also from the web. In other studios, we've worked with generative image making, but we didn't do that this time. At least I don't think, maybe some of the students did, but it wasn't necessarily part of the brief. But yeah, so when I presented this 2 days ago in Zurich, someone said, yes, but what other kinds of applications can you make for this? Because they were seeing it like more only in the teaching setting. But what one of the data sets that I haven't shown, and it's also with the satellite data and stuff, is that we can start to get to know when designing the project, when designing on a particular street and learning about the street, we can start to learn things about, for instance, its geology. So my PhD had to do partially with geology in urban areas. And so just to start to learn about the geology of a particular place gets you kind of interested in it and helps you ask kind of questions about, well, what does it mean that we have, unconsolidated sediments in this particular place? How does that change? I mean, does it change the actual buildings themselves? What was in the ground beneath the street, is that what we're seeing on the facades of 19th century buildings? And then just to sort of develop new questions and to tell, maybe even to think of an architecture project, although I haven't brought this into studio yet, but even to say, how could, the question wasn't for me about studios, it was more about, okay, but the practitioners, what can they do with that? So maybe there's ideas around sort of knowing what kind of questions you can ask or what it is you should ask questions about if you need to work with geologists or geotechnical engineers for a particular building project. But it could have to do also with the questions about vegetation and working with landscape architects and stuff like that. Anyways, maybe you have more ideas about that than I do. But so this is where I am currently with the project, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and questions. Thanks.